Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review. This time around, we've got former San Jose Sharks forward Filip Zadina. Now, Zadina's story is rather interesting. It starts back at the 2018 NHL entry draft. That year, it was rather obvious who would go first overall, kind of like this season with Celebrini. That was Rasmus Dahlin being taken by the Buffalo Sabres. At second overall, most thought it would end up being Svechnikov. It was at third overall where many people had pinned Filip Zadina to be that choice. The only hesitancy was because of the fact that the Montreal Canadiens had that third selection, and it seemed as though they were gunning to pick up a center. But it was expected that Zadina, if not at third overall, would fall maybe one spot. And yet, very surprisingly, on the day of the draft, he did not just drop from third to fourth or even from third to fifth. He fell out of the top five entirely, ending up at sixth overall. And it seemed as though it was a minor miracle for the Detroit Red Wings, who picked him up at sixth overall, that they managed to get a player of his caliber, someone who was thought to easily become a top six 30-goal plus type of scorer at the NHL level. And in his first stint in the NHL, things started decently well. As per usual with a lot of these young prospects in their draft year, it was just a small toe dip into the water of the NHL. He gets 9 games, which is the maximum amount that you can get without burning a year of an entry-level contract. Over those 9 games, he got 3 points, including his first career goal, a decent start to his career. The year after that, while he did not still make the transition to full-time NHLer, there were notable improvements. 28 games played, but over a half point per game over that time. And so after that, it was expected Zadina would quickly transition to being someone who could be relied on for offense with Detroit. And instead, while the games played total continued to rise year after year, the point totals remained relatively stagnant. Zadina never truly found much of a home with the Detroit Red Wings. And so last year, his final season with Detroit, he barely even managed to maintain a lineup spot on Detroit. And so it became an agreement between player and organization that they would mutually terminate his contract so he would have a chance to sort of restart elsewhere his career. And so Mike Grier, the GM of the San Jose Sharks, decided to jump on that opportunity. While Zadina had shown a lot of struggles over the first few seasons of his career, he was still a former 6th overall pick with the pedigree of at least potentially having been a top 3 selection at that draft. And this was an incredibly low-risk move as well. The Sharks simply had to dish out a contract that was incredibly low value. They didn't have to trade anything or sign an offer sheet or anything of that nature. This was a very easy signing for them and had the potential to work out very well. It's not as though the Red Wings had the most competitive roster for Zadina, so it wasn't like he was completely pushed out of the top 6, but when you compare it to the Sharks roster heading into this next season, it should not have been particularly difficult for Zadina to maintain a top 6 spot with San Jose. There really weren't a lot of forwards above him. And while he did occasionally play in the top 6 for the Sharks this past season, it was relatively few and far between those games occurring because Zadina just was not particularly good. Now, don't get me wrong, he had some okay games throughout the season. In fact, he even put up a 4-point performance on one particular night. But even in that game, he was not exactly dominant and just controlling the pace of the play and all over the ice, but more so just he got the bounces, he got a bit lucky, and things worked out in his favor. Throughout much of this season, even in the games that you could consider good for Filip Zadina, he was never really all that great. And most of the time throughout the year, he was relatively invisible and just not contributing much for San Jose. If we take a look at these point totals, they're not terrible. 72 games played, 13 goals, 10 assists for 23 points. You might think, well, that's really bad for someone who got some time in the top 6. But when you compare it to most of the other forwards for the San Jose Sharks, it's actually up there in terms of production, obviously behind the usual suspects of Granlund, Zetterlund, and Eklund. But then right there is Filip Zadina. So the production, and it's also not that much of a departure from his career career production with the Detroit Red Wings. But the thing is that the expectations were slightly higher for him, or at least the hopes were definitely higher for him, that he would manage to turn things around, that he would be able to dig back into what he had success with at the junior level and reach that point, or at least come close to reaching that point with San Jose, and there was nothing of the sort. It was just a season that was plagued with, as per usual with every Sharks player, inconsistencies, and even his high highs weren't really all that impressive. When it comes to his plus minus, we can also see that he had some struggles on the other side of the puck as well. His minus 44 was the second worst on the entire Sharks roster. The only player below him, William Eklund, was at minus 45, but at least when it comes to Eklund, he frequently played in the 6-on-5 situation for San Jose, and the thing is that if you get a goal scored against you at 6-on-5, which is an empty net goal, it still counts as a minus, while Zadina very rarely found himself in that position. If you actually take it strictly on 5-on-5, Zadina is right there at the bottom. It is just not a particularly impressive statistic for Zadina, and while you may not be putting much stock into plus minus as a general stat, individually it doesn't reflect all that well onto him, especially since he did have some time up with some okay players on the second line, with shifts with players like Tomas Hertl in the earlier parts of the season that he just never quite found any success with. When it comes to his time on ice, 13 minutes and 20 seconds, like with many of the players I have recently reviewed at forward, it is right amount in line with a third liner who got occasionally some shifts in the second line, but also some shifts as a fourth liner. Zadina was even sometimes below the double-digit mark in terms of minutes of time on ice throughout this season, just because he was frequently just very unimpressive in terms of performance, but it averaged out to this 13 minutes and 20 seconds. And so when it comes to his grade, while the expectations were not super high for Zadina, I don't think most were expecting him to hit a 30-goal mark. It was a situation where some believed he could run as a decent middle six forward for the San Jose Sharks, and yet he couldn't really quite hit that even so. And then when you also consider the struggles defensively for himself, he ends up with the below average grade of a C-. Class dismissed.